My late brother's wife convinced her daughter to lie in court, accusing me of humiliating and beating her. She had no proof, but the judge still believed her. My revenge was brutal. I never imagined my life would look like this. By my late 30s, I thought I'd be settling down, maybe with a wife, maybe with kids of my own. Instead, I found myself stepping into a role I never saw coming, a father figure to my 14-year-old niece, Emily. My name's Michael. For a bit of context, Emily is my late brother Alex's daughter. 3 years ago, Alex passed away in a car accident, leaving behind his wife, Jessica, and Emily. Ever since, I've done my best to be their rock. Alex wasn't just my little brother. He was my best friend. Losing him broke something in me, but I knew it had shattered Jessica and Emily even more. I took on as much as I could, helping them with the financial struggles, handling the insurance claims, and getting Jessica back on her feet with work. I figured if I could manage the practical side, maybe it would give them the emotional space they needed to start healing. Emily's teenage years have been rocky, to say the least. And Jessica, well, her grief has only grown. More and more, it feels like I'm the only thread holding this fragile family together. But recently, things took a turn I didn't see coming. A couple of weeks ago, Jessica called me, and she sounded broken. She admitted she was still struggling to make ends meet, even with my support. She'd been juggling a part-time job with raising Emily, but the bills were piling up, and it was wearing her down. I could feel the weight of her exhaustion and grief through the phone. "Michael, I don't know what to do," she whispered, her voice shaky with despair. "Jessica, I'll be there," I told her, my heart heavy with worry. "We'll figure this out." When I arrived at her place that evening, Emily was out with friends. Jessica sat alone at the kitchen table, a half-empty bottle of wine in front of her, looking more fragile than I'd ever seen. The weight of responsibility hit me all over again. She looked up at me, and for the first time, I noticed a look in her eyes that felt different. Something in it made me uneasy. We ended up talking for hours that night. Jessica opened up like never before, telling me about her fears of failing as a mother, her unending grief over losing Alex, and her overwhelming loneliness. We'd both had more than a couple of drinks, and at one point, she reached across the table, taking my hand in hers. She held it tightly, her fingers lingering longer than I expected. I didn't pull away, unsure what to make of the moment. There was something intimate in her touch, a connection that felt unexpected and strange. But I brushed it off, chalking it up to the wine and the weight of everything we'd been through. Jessica's vulnerability, mixed with my fierce need to protect both her and Emily, had become a weight I could hardly carry alone. The day after our long talk, I noticed Emily was unusually distant. She barely even looked at me, let alone cracked a smile at my usual bad jokes. She'd been closing herself off more and more, and I began to worry that something was going on beneath the surface. When I mentioned it to Jessica, she just waved it off, saying Emily was just being a teenager. But a week later, that fragile calm shattered. I came home one evening to find Emily sitting on my front steps, her face pale, her whole frame tense. She didn't speak at first, just stared down at the ground, as though she was struggling to hold herself together. "Emily," I said softly, sitting beside her, "what's going on?" After a pause, she murmured, "Uncle Mike, I don't know what to do." Her voice was shaky. "Mom's been acting strange. She gets really upset, then she just cries and cries. It's like I'm not even there. Like I don't matter to her anymore." Her voice cracked, and the pain in her eyes was almost unbearable. My heart sank. Emily had already lost her father, and now it felt like she was losing her mother too. "Emily," I said gently, putting an arm around her, "I'm here for you. Whatever you need, I'm here." From that day on, Emily clung to me, coming to me every time things with Jessica went off the rails. She was desperate for some sense of stability, and I was trying my hardest to provide it. Meanwhile, Jessica's behavior continued to spiral. She started calling me late at night, sounding frantic, her words chaotic and barely making sense. She'd go on and on about work, venting about things that seemed entirely disconnected from reality. One night, after an especially disturbing phone call, I drove over to Jessica's house. I walked in to find her pacing the living room, muttering angrily to herself, while Emily hid in her room, terrified. "Jessica, this has to stop," I said firmly, trying to keep my voice calm. "You need help, and Emily needs you to get it." Jessica spun to face me, her eyes blazing with a fury I'd never seen. "Don't you dare tell me how to raise my daughter," she screamed, her voice raw, almost feral. It was like staring at a stranger. Behind her, I saw Emily peeking out of her room, her eyes wide with fear, watching her mother unravel before her eyes. At that moment, I realized just how far Jessica had fallen. She wasn't simply grieving, she was breaking down, and she was pulling Emily down with her. I couldn't leave Emily there. Not like that. I told her to pack a bag, and I took her home with me that night, promising her it would only be temporary. In the car, she was silent, but when we reached my place, she hugged me tightly, her voice choked with emotion. "Thank you, Uncle Mike," she whispered. "I don't know what I'd do without you." The days that followed were chaos. Jessica called constantly, her mood shifting wildly between tearful apologies and furious rants. One minute she was begging me to bring Emily back, the next, she was accusing me of trying to steal her daughter away. Jessica's accusations cut deep, but I could see she felt betrayed, as though my decision to take Emily in was some kind of personal attack on her parenting. But I couldn't just leave Emily in that chaos. She needed stability, someone she could trust. Jessica's behavior had become too erratic, too unpredictable. Then, one evening, Jessica showed up at my house unannounced. She was visibly upset, her face flushed, her voice loud and cutting as she accused me of trying to steal Emily away, of undermining her as a mother. I watched Emily shrink back, her expression a mixture of fear and shame, trying to make herself invisible in the face of her mother's rage. "Jessica, calm down," I said, trying to keep my tone even. "This isn't about you or me. It's about Emily and making sure she's okay." "She's my daughter," Jessica screamed, her voice cracking. "You don't get to make decisions for her." Emily's face was streaked with tears as she looked up, her voice small. "Mom, please, you're scaring me." For a moment, Jessica's expression softened, a flicker of realization crossing her face. She looked around, almost confused, as if she didn't even know how she'd ended up here. Then, without a word, she turned on her heel and walked away, leaving Emily and me standing in stunned silence. That night, Emily broke down. She confessed she was scared to go back home, describing nights when Jessica would drink until she was nearly unconscious, leaving Emily to fend for herself. Her wide, fearful eyes filled with pain as she recounted how her mom would lock herself in her room for hours, or suddenly lash out over the smallest things. "I don't want to hate her," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "But sometimes it's like she's not even my mom anymore." Hearing that broke me. I knew Jessica was struggling, but I hadn't realized how deeply it was affecting Emily. I pulled her into a hug, reassuring her that she could stay with me as long as she needed. In that moment, I made a silent promise to myself. I wouldn't let her down. I'd do whatever it took to protect her. But the situation with Jessica only worsened. She began showing up at Emily's school, creating scenes, accusing teachers of conspiring against her. I started receiving frantic calls from the school, asking me to come down and handle things. Each time, I was left feeling more drained, more exhausted, as if I were constantly putting out fires that Jessica kept setting. Then one night, Jessica called me, her voice slurred, pleading with me to bring Emily home. She promised things would be different, that she'd changed, that she could make it right. But I could hear the desperation in her voice, and I knew deep down it was just another empty promise. I tried to reason with her, suggesting that maybe she get some help, that Emily needed stability and couldn't go back to that environment. But that only made her angrier. She shouted at me, then hung up. I sat there in the silence, staring at the phone, feeling the weight of it all pressing down on me. I realized then that this wasn't just about protecting Emily from her mother's volatility. It was about making a choice, a painful choice, to shield her from the person Jessica had become, even if it meant cutting ties completely. Days turned into weeks, and Jessica's behavior only grew more erratic. She started spreading rumors around town, claiming that I was trying to take Emily away from her, that I was somehow poisoning Emily against her mother. People I'd known for years began looking at me with suspicion, their smiles fading into cold glances. It hurt deeply. I was just trying to do the right thing, yet it felt like I was losing everyone in the process. Then one evening, as Emily and I were sitting down for dinner, there was a knock at the door. I opened it to find a social worker standing there, looking apologetic but resolute. She explained that they'd received complaints. Jessica had accused me of keeping Emily against her will. Emily, overhearing, quickly joined us at the door, her face pale with worry. "I want to stay here," she said, her voice shaking but determined. "What my mom said, it's not true." The social worker took notes, nodding, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. Jessica had managed to create a mess, and now I was left to untangle it alone. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, wondering how everything had spiraled so far out of control. Jessica had once been family, someone I'd cared about and tried to protect, but now she'd become a stranger, someone so consumed by her own pain that she was tearing apart the very family she'd vowed to care for. I looked over at Emily, who had finally fallen asleep on the couch, her face softened in sleep. Seeing her like that renewed my resolve. No matter what happened, I would stand by her, shielding her from the storm her mother had become, even if it meant losing everything else. But things took a darker turn the next morning. I was sitting at the kitchen table, sipping my coffee, still trying to wrap my head around Jessica's latest outburst the night before, when my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but something made me pick it up. "Is this Michael Garrett?" a tense, serious voice asked. "Yes, this is Michael," I replied, feeling unease creeping up my spine. "This is Officer Riley with the District Police Department. We need you to come in for questioning regarding a complaint. It's about your niece, Emily." The words hit me like a physical blow. My heart dropped, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. "Emily? What complaint?" My mind raced, flashing through every interaction, every conversation, every moment we'd shared, desperate to understand what could possibly be happening. "Can I ask what this is about?" I managed, my voice barely steady. "Sir, it's best if we discuss this in person. Please come to the station as soon as possible." 20 minutes later, I found myself standing in a sterile gray room at the police station, heart pounding, my palms clammy. The walls felt like they were closing in as I waited, replaying every moment of the past few weeks, wondering just how far Jessica's accusations had gone, and what I'd have to do to prove the truth. Officer Riley, a stern woman in her early 40s with piercing, unreadable eyes, sat across from me, flanked by Detective Martinez, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. They hadn't told me anything yet, and the silence stretched so thin it felt like it could snap. I was sweating, my heart racing, but I forced myself to keep steady, to hold it together. Then Riley cleared her throat. "Mr. Garrett," she began, her voice careful, measured, "your niece, Emily, has made an allegation against you." It felt like the ground had fallen away beneath me. "An allegation?" I managed to whisper, my voice barely audible. "She's claiming inappropriate behavior," Riley continued, her words slow and deliberate, as if each one was a live grenade. "Specifically, she says you've been making advances toward her." It took a second to even process the words, but when I did, the horror and disbelief hit me like a freight train. That's not true," I stammered, feeling panic clawing at my chest. I'd never do anything like that to Emily. She's like a daughter to me." Riley's face remained unmoved, her eyes watching me closely, scanning for any sign of weakness or guilt. "Mr. Garrett, I understand that this is difficult to hear," she said, her tone detached but firm. "But we take accusations like this very seriously, especially when they involve a minor. This doesn't make any sense," I pleaded, desperation creeping into my voice. "There has to be some kind of misunderstanding. Emily's been through so much. She lost her father, her mother's barely managing. I'm just trying to hold things together. I don't know why she would say something like this." But as the words left my mouth, a dark realization crept in. Jessica. Her erratic behavior, the wild accusations she'd thrown at me, the resentment in her eyes every time she looked at me. Had she put Emily up to this? Was this her twisted way of punishing me for stepping in where she'd been failing? As if reading my thoughts, Riley continued, "Your sister-in-law, Jessica, is supporting Emily's statement. She claims she's noticed certain behaviors of yours around Emily for some time and says she's worried for her daughter's safety." The betrayal hit me like a physical blow, nearly knocking the wind out of me. Jessica, the woman I'd stood by, supported financially and emotionally, the woman I'd tried to help through her darkest moments, was backing this nightmare. My vision blurred, the room feeling claustrophobic, like the walls were closing in. Can I talk to her?" I asked, my voice shaking. "To Jessica?" Riley shook her head, her expression unyielding. "We've advised her not to have any contact with you during the investigation." The investigation. The word echoed in my mind, hollow and unforgiving. This wasn't just a misunderstanding to be cleared up. They were treating me like a criminal. My mind spun, frantically trying to make sense of it. What could Emily possibly think I'd done? How could everything I'd done to keep her safe and protect her be turned into something so twisted, so unrecognizable? And why was Jessica so quick to throw me under the bus? I left the station with a court order to stay away from both Emily and Jessica until the case was resolved. They made it clear that any misstep, any attempt to reach out, could mean immediate arrest. Each step back to my car felt like sinking into quicksand, my life slowly disappearing beneath me. Over the next few days, I barely slept. I paced around my apartment, replaying every memory of my time with Emily, searching for any clue that this accusation had been coming. But all I found were innocent moments, our shared jokes, late-night talks about her dad, the look of relief on her face whenever she was at my place, safe. Nothing in my memory fit with what they were accusing me of. 3 days later, my lawyer and old friend, Marcus Reed, showed up at my door. I'd known Marcus since college. He was one of the few people I could trust completely. He sat me down, looked me square in the eyes, and said, "Michael, this is going to get ugly. Jessica's already painting you as some kind of predator. She's pulling in people from the neighborhood, claiming they've seen concerning things. It's all just insinuation, but it's enough to fan the flames." I felt a numbness settle over me. People from the neighborhood? What could they possibly have seen? I rarely did anything out of the ordinary. Went to work, came home, spent time with Emily and Jessica. Now, somehow, every innocent interaction was being twisted into something grotesque. Marcus leaned forward, his voice low and steady. "Michael, we need to find out if Jessica has said anything to Emily, anything that might explain why she's going along with this." I nodded, my mind racing. Jessica had always been protective of Emily, but lately, her protectiveness had turned obsessive, almost paranoid. She'd always been somewhat jealous of the bond Emily and I shared, maybe even resentful of it. But would she go this far just to hurt me? Marcus went to work immediately, investigating every angle, speaking to anyone who might shed light on why Emily would make such an accusation. He spoke with Emily's school counselor, Mrs. Thompson, who admitted that Emily had seemed withdrawn recently but hadn't mentioned me or hinted at any problems at home. Mrs. Thompson was clearly uncomfortable, her expression a mix of sympathy and doubt, as if she didn't know who to believe. Meanwhile, my life began to crumble. Every knock on the door sent me into a panic, fearing another blow, another accusation. I could barely leave my apartment without feeling the weight of judgmental stares. Rumors spread quickly, and before long, it felt like everyone in town had an opinion on my character. Friends began pulling away, colleagues became distant, and even casual acquaintances avoided me. I felt like I was becoming a pariah in my own life. Everywhere I turned, people looked at me with suspicion or outright disgust. The only person who stood by me was Marcus, who was relentless in his search for the truth. He'd been digging into Jessica's past, hoping to find anything that could explain her behavior. One afternoon, he showed up at my apartment, his expression dark. "Michael, there's something you need to know," he said, his voice low and serious. "Jessica's in serious debt. It's bad. She owes money all over town, barely staying afloat." I felt a knot form in my stomach, but he wasn't finished. "Here's the kicker," he said grimly. "She recently tried to take out a new life insurance policy on Emily, a big one." A sick realization washed over me. Could this be about money? Had Jessica concocted this entire scheme to ruin me and somehow profit from it? The thought twisted my gut, but it was the first explanation that made any sense. If she could paint me as a monster, maybe she thought she could take control of everything. Emily's life, and any financial support that might come from the family or from insurance. But without proof, it was nothing more than a dark theory, one that no one would believe, especially not with Jessica and Emily both testifying against me. Then, the next day, things took an unexpected turn. I was sitting alone in my apartment, lost in thought, when I received a message from an unknown number. The message was brief. "Meet me at the corner of 8th and Maple tonight at 1 a.m. Come alone." It was risky, maybe even foolish, but desperation left me little choice. I arrived at the corner just before 1, waiting in the shadows, heart pounding as I scanned the empty street. Then, a figure emerged from the darkness, glancing around nervously. It was Mrs. Thompson, Emily's school counselor. She looked anxious, casting quick glances over her shoulder as if afraid of being seen. "Mr. Garrett," she whispered, "I don't have much time. I shouldn't even be doing this, but I think you deserve to know. Emily's been struggling with something, and I don't think it has anything to do with you." "What do you mean?" I asked, desperate for answers. She hesitated, clearly torn. "I can't say much, but I've noticed things. Emily's been extremely anxious, almost paranoid. I overheard her talking to her mom, saying she didn't want to do this anymore." She looked at me, her face conflicted. "I don't know what it means, but something doesn't feel right. It's like she's afraid of her own mother." Mrs. Thompson's words hit me like a bolt of lightning, confirming my worst fears. Jessica was manipulating Emily, coercing her into this nightmare for her own twisted reasons. She handed me a small slip of paper. "This is my number. If you need anything, call me. But be careful, Mr. Garrett. Jessica, she's more dangerous than you think." With that, she slipped back into the shadows, disappearing into the night. For the first time in days, I felt a spark of hope. I finally had an ally, someone who saw past Jessica's lies. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a glimmer of hope. Mrs. Thompson believed me. She saw through Jessica's facade. But I knew that the road to the truth would be anything but easy and that getting there would come at a price. The days after the accusation blurred together into endless interrogations, tense silences, and sleepless nights. I was called back to the station for a second round of questioning, this time under harsher scrutiny. Every answer felt like a minefield. The cold fluorescent lights overhead seemed to amplify the officers' expressions as they watched me, dissecting my every word, looking for any hint of guilt. They didn't say it outright, but I could see it in their eyes. They already believed I was guilty. Just when I thought it couldn't get worse, Marcus informed me that Emily was being questioned again as well. The police insisted they needed to be thorough, given the severity of the accusations, but I wondered if they realized the psychological toll they were putting on a 13-year-old girl or an innocent man. Days passed without any updates, each one more torturous than the last. Then one morning, my phone rang. It was Marcus, his voice tense, yet carrying a hint of something that sounded almost like urgency. "Michael, they want you down at the station." "It's about Emily," he said, pausing. "I think you might finally get some answers." My heart pounded as I made my way to the police station, my mind racing through every possible scenario. Part of me wanted to believe that Emily had finally told the truth, but I was terrified to hope, afraid that letting my guard down would only bring more pain. The past few weeks had left me questioning everything: my instincts, my relationships, even my own sanity. When I arrived, Officer Riley was waiting outside the interrogation room, her expression unreadable. Beside her stood a woman I didn't recognize, a psychologist named Dr. Lauren Callahan, who specialized in adolescent trauma and abuse cases. Her face was calm, professional, but there was a glint of compassion in her eyes. "Mr. Garrett, this is Dr. Callahan," Riley explained. "She's been working with Emily over the past few days. Emily's made some progress, and she's agreed to speak with us again." Dr. Callahan nodded, her gaze steady. "Emily has been under an immense amount of pressure. What she's going through is complex, and it's taken time for her to open up. But I believe she's ready now." The door to the interrogation room opened, and I was led inside. Emily was already seated at the table, her eyes fixed on the floor, looking so small and vulnerable it nearly broke me. Her shoulders were hunched, her hands clasped tightly together as though she was holding herself together by sheer force of will. Seeing her like that, so defeated and broken, was unbearable. "Uncle," she whispered, barely looking up, her voice trembling. The word hung in the air, filled with a mix of shame and desperation. I wanted nothing more than to take her hand, to reassure her that everything would be okay, but I held back, sensing that this was her moment, that whatever came next needed to come from her alone. Dr. Callahan spoke gently. "Emily, it's okay. We're all here to listen, and you're safe." Emily took a shaky breath, her fingers twisting together. Her voice was barely audible, but her words carried a weight that filled the room. I didn't want to do this. Mom, she said it was the only way to fix things. She said it was the only way we could stay together." A wave of anger and sadness washed over me, but I forced myself to stay calm, my eyes fixed on her as she struggled to continue. She told me, Emily's voice wavered, and she squeezed her eyes shut, as if bracing herself. She told me to say that you'd hurt me. But it wasn't true. None of it was true. My chest tightened, relief mixing with grief. I wanted to reach out to her, to hold her and tell her that none of this was her fault, but all I could do was wait, listening as she let the truth spill out, piece by painful piece. Dr. Callahan put a comforting hand on Emily's shoulder. "You've done the right thing, Emily. You've been very brave." Emily looked at me, her face filled with guilt and sorrow. "I'm so sorry, Uncle Mike. I didn't know what else to do. She said we'd lose everything if I didn't go along with it." I nodded, blinking back tears, my voice thick with emotion. "It's okay, Emily. You did nothing wrong. I'm just so glad you're safe." Officer Riley's gaze softened, and she looked at Dr. Callahan, nodding slightly. It was over. The truth had finally come to light. But as I looked at Emily, trembling and broken, I knew that the scars from this ordeal would remain, for both of us. "Mike," she whispered, her voice so soft and broken that it barely sounded like her. I almost didn't recognize the girl sitting across from me, a shell of the lively, trusting niece I'd known. "Emily, I'm here," I said, struggling to keep my emotions under control. Dr. Callahan placed a gentle hand on Emily's shoulder, her tone soothing. "You're safe here, Emily. No one can hurt you. Just take your time and tell us what you need to say." Emily swallowed hard, her gaze darting briefly to the two-way mirror, then back down at her hands. She took a shaky breath, her shoulders trembling. "Mom, she told me to say those things about you," Emily whispered, her words barely audible. "She said, if I didn't, she'd make my life miserable. She said that no one would believe me anyway, but if I didn't do it, I'd regret it." Each word landed like a physical blow, the horror of what she was saying sinking in. I tried to wrap my mind around the idea that Jessica, someone I'd trusted and supported, had coerced her own daughter into fabricating such a monstrous lie. She told you to accuse me?" I asked, my voice thick with disbelief. Emily nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "She said it was the only way. She said we needed money and if I didn't go along with it, we'd end up on the streets. She made me feel like I had no choice." Dr. Callahan gently squeezed Emily's shoulder, a steady presence by her side. "Emily, you've been incredibly brave. It's not easy to stand up to someone you love, especially when that person is your own mother." Officer Riley cleared her throat, her expression barely concealing the anger and disbelief beneath. "Emily, do you understand what your mother intended to do with these accusations?" Emily's face crumpled, her small frame almost collapsing in on itself. She wanted to blackmail Uncle Mike," she said, her voice breaking. "She told me that if he didn't pay, she'd make sure he went to jail. She said no one would believe him over me." Hearing it from Emily's own trembling voice made the reality hit even harder. Jessica had been willing to destroy my life, traumatize her own daughter, all for money. The sheer cruelty of it left me momentarily speechless. A surge of anger burned within me, but I forced myself to stay calm. This wasn't about me, it was about helping Emily. Dr. Callahan leaned closer, her voice as steady as her gaze. "Emily, by coming forward, you've done the right thing. You're safe now. Your mom can't hurt you anymore." Emily looked up at me, her tear-streaked face a mixture of guilt and relief. "I'm so sorry, Uncle Mike," she choked out. "I didn't want to do it. I swear, I didn't want to hurt you." I felt my heart crack, and I reached across the table, holding her hands gently. "Emily, you have nothing to apologize for. I know you were scared. I'm just so proud of you for being brave and telling the truth." As she looked at me, a glimmer of relief flickered in her eyes. In that moment, I made a silent vow that no matter what it took, I would protect her and make sure she never had to live in fear again. This fight wasn't over, but together, I knew we could finally begin to heal. My head was spinning, my heart breaking at the sight of Emily's pain. I reached over, placing a hand on her shoulder. "It's okay, Emily. I'm just glad you told the truth." For a moment, the room fell silent, the weight of Emily's confession settling over us like a thick fog. Officer Riley stepped out, likely coordinating with someone on the other side of the glass about what to do next. Dr. Callahan stayed beside Emily, murmuring words of encouragement, helping her slow her breathing and steady her trembling hands. After a few minutes, Riley returned, her face set in a grim expression. "Mr. Garrett, thank you for your patience. We'll be taking appropriate measures regarding Jessica's actions. For now, we think it's best if Emily stays somewhere safe." I nodded, still reeling. I'd spent weeks living in a nightmare, my life turned upside down by a lie, and now, in the span of minutes, everything had changed. But the damage was done. My reputation, my name, my trust in the people I loved, everything had been tainted by Jessica's betrayal. In the days that followed, Emily stayed with me, and with Dr. Callahan's support, we began the slow, painful journey toward healing. Emily still struggled with guilt, and sometimes, I'd catch her looking at me with a mixture of sorrow and shame. It tore at me, but I knew that together we'd find our way through. One evening, as we sat in the quiet of the living room, she finally spoke up. "Uncle Mike, will people ever look at you the same again?" I took a deep breath, searching for the right words. "I don't know, Emily. Some people might never change their minds. But that's okay. I don't care what they think. I care about you. And we know the truth. That's all that matters." She nodded, her face thoughtful and solemn. I don't know if I can ever forgive Mom for this." I swallowed, my own voice thick with emotion. "I don't know if I can, either. But we don't have to decide that now. Right now, we focus on moving forward." Jessica's manipulation had left scars on both of us, scars that would take years to heal. The betrayal was deep, and the trust was shattered. But as Emily and I sat there together in the quiet, I felt a flicker of hope. We'd made it through the worst of it. And while the future was uncertain, one thing was clear: we'd face it side by side. The day I decided to confront Jessica was gray and cold, a fitting backdrop for one of the hardest conversations of my life. Ever since Emily had come forward, revealing how Jessica had manipulated her into accusing me of something so vile, I'd been torn between heartbreak and fury. The betrayal cut deep, and as much as I wanted to move on, I knew I couldn't until I faced her. We arranged to meet at a small cafe on the far side of town, somewhere out of the way where no one who knew us might overhear what was about to unfold. When I arrived, Jessica was already there, sitting by the window with her back to the door, fidgeting with her phone and glancing around the room like she was bracing herself. As I approached, she looked up, her face guarded. There was no sign of guilt, no hint of shame, just a hard, stony calm that sent a chill down my spine. I sat down across from her, my jaw tight as I fought to keep the anger simmering beneath the surface under control. "Jessica," I began, my voice low, steady, "we need to talk about what you did, about what you put Emily and me through." She looked down, twisting her fingers around her coffee cup, and for a moment I thought she might actually apologize. But then she looked up, her eyes cold and hard. "I did what I had to do, Michael. You wouldn't understand." I stared at her, disbelief coursing through me. "Wouldn't understand," I repeated, my voice trembling with restrained fury. "You accused me of abusing Emily. You nearly destroyed my reputation, turned my life upside down, and you want me to understand?" She sighed, almost as if she were the one being inconvenienced. "You don't get it. I was desperate, okay? After Alex died, everything fell apart. The bills kept piling up, and I had no way to pay them. I didn't have a choice." "There's always a choice, Jessica," I said, my patience waning. "And you chose to hurt your own daughter, to drag her into something horrific, to use her as a weapon against me. All for money." Her face twisted into a scowl, her eyes narrowing. "Don't act so high and mighty," she spat. "You've always been the golden boy, the one everyone loves. I was struggling while you sat there with your steady job, your nice house, your perfect life. You wouldn't lift a finger to help us unless you had to. So I made sure you had to." Her words hit me like a slap. This wasn't about survival. It was about jealousy, resentment. She blamed me for everything she felt she'd lost, for the life she believed she deserved. And instead of asking for help, she tried to tear me down, to break me in the cruelest way possible. "I was helping, Jessica," I said, my voice trembling with emotion. "I've been helping you since Alex passed away. I covered your bills, helped with Emily, did everything I could to make sure you two were okay." But she just shook her head, her gaze bitter and unyielding. "It wasn't enough. It's never been enough. You could never understand what it's like to lose everything. I felt a surge of anger rise in me, but I held it back. I'd come here for answers, and I was finally seeing the full picture, a picture painted in jealousy, resentment, and her twisted need to bring me down. "You've hurt Emily more than you could ever understand," I said, my voice heavy with disgust. "You tried to ruin me, and in the process, you destroyed her trust, her innocence, everything good she saw in you." Jessica looked away, her jaw clenched. For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of doubt in her eyes, but it vanished as quickly as it came. "I did what I had to do," she whispered, her voice cold. I stood up, feeling a weight lift as I prepared to walk away. "You didn't just lose Alex, Jessica. You lost me, and you lost Emily. And that's something you'll have to live with." Without another word, I left her sitting there in the cafe, surrounded by the remnants of her anger and regret. As I stepped outside, the cold air filled my lungs, and I felt, for the first time in a long while, a sense of freedom. The road ahead would be long, but I knew that Emily and I would face it together, without Jessica's shadow darkening our path. I held Jessica's gaze, feeling the weight of every betrayal and lie between us. "I've been there for you, Jessica, through everything," I said, my voice tight with anger. "But that ends today. No more support, no more help. You're on your own." Jessica's face went pale, her usual bravado slipping as panic flickered in her eyes. You can't just leave us with nothing. What about Emily? You're punishing her, too." I shook my head, my heart heavy. "Emily can stay with me. She deserves a safe, stable home, something you can't provide. But I won't support you anymore. Not after everything you've done." Her eyes narrowed, her expression hardening with a flash of anger. "You think you can just take her from me? She's my daughter." "She's also my niece, and I'll fight to keep her safe if I have to," I replied, my tone unyielding. "You lost the right to make demands the moment you decided to use her as part of your scheme." Jessica opened her mouth to argue, but her gaze shifted to the side, and she stopped short. Following her line of sight, I saw Marcus, my lawyer, standing by the cafe entrance, watching closely. He'd insisted on coming along, just in case Jessica tried to stir up more trouble. Seeing him, there was a reminder to her, and to me, that I wasn't alone in this fight. "You haven't heard the last of this, Michael," she hissed, grabbing her coat and shoving past me as she stormed out of the cafe. I watched her go, a mix of relief and sadness filling me. This was the end of a chapter I'd never wanted or imagined, but for Emily's sake, and for my own peace of mind, it had to be done. Filing a police report against Jessica was a decision I never thought I'd make. The idea of legally pursuing someone who'd once been family, someone I'd once trusted, felt unnatural. But Jessica had crossed a line. She tried to ruin my life, traumatized her own daughter, and left lasting scars on all of us. It was time to bring the truth into the light. The next morning, I walked into the police station with Marcus by my side. His presence was a comfort, a steady reminder that I wasn't in this alone. Still, my stomach churned as I approached the front desk. Officer Riley, who'd initially questioned me, recognized me immediately and stepped forward, a look of understanding in her eyes. "We're here to file a report against Jessica Garrett," Marcus explained, his voice professional but firm. Riley nodded, leading us into a small office. As I sat down, emotions washed over me, anger, sorrow, and a lingering sense of betrayal. I took a deep breath, gathering my thoughts, and recounted every painful detail: the accusations, the blackmail, Emily's confession, and Jessica's relentless campaign to dismantle my life. By the time I finished, Riley was silent, nodding thoughtfully as she processed everything. It was clear this was no ordinary case of family discord. This was betrayal on a level I'd never thought possible. With the report filed, I knew there would be more battles to come, but I also felt a sense of relief, a burden lifting. Jessica's actions would finally be brought to light, and I could begin to rebuild the pieces of my life, with Emily by my side. Whatever the future held, I knew that together, we could face it. Officer Riley listened intently as I recounted everything, her face grave. She took detailed notes, and when I finished, she assured me that Jessica's actions would be thoroughly investigated. In the following weeks, things happened fast. Jessica was arrested on charges of child endangerment and attempted blackmail, and word quickly spread through the family. Soon, everyone seemed to have an opinion, some horrified that Jessica could have orchestrated such a twisted scheme, while others were skeptical, convinced I was overreacting. The family was divided, and each call, each conversation, left me feeling more alienated. One evening, I picked up a call from my Aunt Linda, who'd always been close to Jessica. Her tone was sharp, almost accusatory. "Michael, I can't believe you'd do this," she snapped. "Jessica's already lost so much, and now you're going to put her behind bars?" "She put herself there, Aunt Linda," I replied, struggling to keep my patience. "She used her own daughter to try to blackmail me. How can you defend that?" Linda huffed, her tone softening slightly. I can't believe she'd do something like that. She's family, Michael. Family sticks together." I took a deep breath, doing my best to keep my composure. She stopped being family the moment she used Emily as a weapon. I'm not going to sit by and let her destroy lives. The call ended on a sour note, and after that, more calls came pouring in, each one a variation of the same argument. Cousins, uncles, even family friends weighed in, some expressing sympathy, others casting doubt. It felt like a second betrayal, as though everyone I'd once counted on was turning their back on me. In the midst of the chaos, I focused on work, throwing myself into my job to stay grounded. Marcus checked in regularly, keeping me updated on Jessica's case, and I found a strange sense of satisfaction in knowing that, at least in the eyes of the law, justice was being served. But the damage was done. My family was fractured, and Emily was left in the middle of it all, caught between the shadows of betrayal and an uncertain future. A few months later, I received a call from Child Welfare Services. The social worker, a calm-voiced woman named Ms. Bennett, spoke carefully, clearly aware of the sensitivity of the situation. "Mr. Garrett," she began gently, "given the circumstances, we'd like to discuss the possibility of you taking Emily into temporary custody." The request hit me like a punch to the gut. I hadn't expected this. I hadn't prepared myself for the idea of becoming Emily's guardian after everything that had happened. Part of me wanted to say yes immediately, to step in and be there for her without hesitation. But another part of me hesitated, understanding the responsibility that would come with this new role. "I'd do anything for Emily," I replied, my voice steady but heavy with emotion. "If she needs a stable home, I'll be that for her." Ms. Bennett paused, her tone gentle. "We don't need an answer immediately. Take some time to think it over. We'll arrange a meeting to discuss what this would entail." After I hung up, I sat there, staring out the window, feeling the weight of everything settle over me. Taking Emily in was a commitment, a new chapter in a story I hadn't planned to write. But despite everything, I knew I couldn't turn my back on her. Part of me, a part one hated, was hesitant. How could I care for a girl who'd once accused me of something so horrendous, even if I knew it hadn't been her choice? "Can I have some time to think about it?" I asked, my voice sounding distant, even to my own ears. "Of course," Ms. Bennett replied, her tone full of understanding. "Take as much time as you need. Emily's well-being is our priority, and we want to ensure she's placed in a safe, supportive environment." I spent the next few days agonizing over the decision. Every memory of Emily replayed in my mind. Her laughter, her vulnerability, the way she'd looked at me when she finally told the truth. But underneath those memories was a raw wound, a reminder of the trust that had been shattered. Finally, I arranged to meet with her, hoping that seeing her in person might give me some clarity. When she arrived at my apartment, she looked nervous, her eyes downcast as she hovered in the doorway. I invited her in, and we sat down in the living room, the silence stretching between us like an invisible wall. "Emily," I began slowly, choosing my words carefully, "I want you to know that I don't blame you for what happened. I know it wasn't your choice." She nodded, her face pale. "I know, Uncle Mike. I'm sorry for everything. I wish I could take it all back." Hearing her apology stirred up a storm of emotions, but I forced myself to stay composed. "I believe you, Emily, and I know you didn't want any of this. But trust, it's not something that can just be fixed overnight." She looked up at me, her eyes filled with regret. "I know. I just thought, maybe we could try again. I don't have anyone else." Her words cut deep, and a pang of guilt washed over me. I knew she needed stability, a fresh start. But I also knew that, for my own peace of mind, I needed distance. Taking her in would mean constantly facing the shadows of everything that had happened, and I wasn't sure I could do that. "Emily, you're strong. I know you'll find your way," I said, my voice gentle but resolute. "But I think for now, it's best if you stay with someone who can give you that fresh start, a place where you're not haunted by everything that's happened. Tears filled her eyes, and she looked away, nodding slowly. I understand. The conversation ended in a quiet, painful goodbye. As she walked out of my apartment, I felt a complicated mix of relief and sorrow. I knew I'd made the right choice, but it didn't make it any easier. In the months that followed, I focused on rebuilding my life, on finding a sense of normalcy that had been lost in the chaos. Family members continued to reach out, some wanting to mend fractured relationships, others clinging to their anger and judgment. But I kept my distance, determined to find my footing on my own terms. As time passed, I felt the weight of what had happened begin to lift, slowly but surely. I would always care for Emily and hope for her healing, but I had to let go, both for her sake and for mine. Keeping my distance was the only way to protect myself, to hold on to some semblance of peace. Looking back on everything, the betrayal, the broken trust, I realized that some things were beyond repair. The faith I'd once had in my family, the bond I'd shared with Emily, all of it was fractured in ways no apology could mend. It was a painful truth to accept, but in letting go, I found a strange sense of peace. In stepping back, I allowed myself room to breathe, room to heal. And maybe, just maybe, Emily would find her own way and build a life untouched by the shadows of the past. She was resilient, and I hoped that distance would allow her the chance to start fresh, to heal in her own time. As for me, I'd come to understand that sometimes the only way to heal is to walk away. It wasn't the ending I'd envisioned, but it was the closure I needed. And in that acceptance, I finally found the strength to start anew, to look forward, leaving the pain and betrayal behind.